There are moments when your biology decides that your carefully constructed life is a joke. Not your degrees, not your ironclad boundaries, not the 6 years of experimental high-dose suppressants you built your entire medical career around. Just your body deciding right now, in the absolute worst possible place, that the rules no longer apply. For me, that moment came on a Thursday afternoon, 80 floors below Manhattan, inside the underground security vault of the Sinclair Tower. I was in the middle of a specialized neural therapy session for pheromone irritability syndrome. My patients were Declan Rowan and Holden Sinclair, 3 brothers, triplets, 3 apex alphas who effectively owned Wall Street, and who for the past 45 minutes had been perfectly subdued by my psychological guidance. I was in control. I was always in control. Until the grid failed. It didn't happen with a dramatic explosion. It happened with a sickening, definitive clicking sound. The lights died instantly, plunging the reinforced concrete room into emergency crimson. The low, steady hum of the industrial HVAC system, the one filtering millions of cubic feet of air, groaned, stuttered, and spun down into dead silence. Then came the voice, a cold automated AI echoing from the ceiling speakers. Critical network failure. Protocol lockdown initiated. Titanium atmospheric seals engaged. The heavy magnetic locks of the only door slammed shut with a sound like a vault sealing a tomb. "What the hell is this?" Declan's voice cut through the dark, sharp, and immediate, laced with the kind of authority that expected reality to bend to its will. Backup generators should have kicked in. Rowan noted his tone, dangerously calm, analytical. I could hear the rustle of his bespoke suit as he shifted in his leather chair. "They didn't." Holden added closer to my left. "We're sealed in." I didn't speak. I couldn't, because the moment the ventilation stopped, the temperature in the room began to rise. It was a closed box occupied by 4 adult men wrapped in a cocoon of titanium and concrete. And as the air grew stagnant, something inside me snapped. It started as a prickle at the base of my neck, a sudden suffocating wave of heat that had absolutely nothing to do with the room's thermostat. My hands resting on the cold glass surface of the center table began to tremble. No, not now. I am an Omega. It is a biological reality I have violently suppressed since my residency at Johns Hopkins, ever since Dr. Vance looked at my groundbreaking research and told the board that an Omega driven by hormonal cycles could never be a competent neuropsychiatrist. I proved him wrong. I took experimental inhibitors. I froze my biology. I became Dr. Julian Hayes, the untouchable, emotionless professional. But the sudden spike in ambient heat, combined with the claustrophobic panic of the lockdown, was acting as a catalyst. The inhibitor I injected this morning was burning out of my bloodstream. Every sound in the windowless room became unbearably loud. The ticking of Holden's Patek Philippe watch, the slight shift of Declan's leather shoes, the sound of my own pulse hammering violently against my eardrums. My vision blurred at the edges. I could feel the suppressants failing, the chemical dam breaking apart. And with it came the scent. My scent. Usually locked down to a sterile, imperceptible blankness, it was now blooming out of me in heavy, desperate waves. Jasmine and warm vanilla, sweet, terrified, unmistakably Omega. In a room with an active ventilation system, I might have had 10 minutes. In this sealed titanium vault, I had seconds. I tried to breathe shallowly, praying they wouldn't notice, praying for the emergency lights to turn green. But they were alphas. And they were already on the edge of pheromone irritability. The exact moment the illusion shattered was marked by a single drop of sweat. It rolled down my temple, hung on my jawline, and fell, hitting the glass table with a microscopic tapping sound. In the heavy, stagnant silence, it sounded like a gunshot. Immediately, 3 sounds echoed in the crimson dark. 1, 2, 3. Heavy, raspy intakes of breath. In perfect, horrifying unison. "Doctor." Holden's voice was no longer conversational. It was a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shockwave of pure biological terror straight down my spine. "Julian." Declan didn't use my title. The air around him suddenly felt suffocatingly thick with the scent of crushed cedar and sharp winter cold. Rowan didn't speak, but the smell of rain-soaked earth and ozone spiked so violently it made my head spin. They could smell me. They knew exactly what I was and exactly what was happening to me. The 3 predators I was supposed to be treating were waking up. My chair scraped harshly against the floor as I stood up, my legs barely supporting my weight. I stumbled backward, retreating until my spine hit the cold, unyielding concrete of the far wall. My shaking hand reached into my inner suit pocket, fingers closing desperately around a small metal cylinder, an emergency adrenaline suppressant auto-injector. It was highly illegal, entirely untested, and carried a 40% chance of inducing sudden cardiac arrest. But right now, it was my only defense. I pulled the cap off with my teeth, my breath coming in ragged, pathetic gasps. I stood in the corner, clutching the needle to my chest, the heat consuming my rational mind. I had a choice to make in the dark: inject myself and risk stopping my own heart, or lower the syringe and face the three shadows slowly rising from their chairs. The tip of the auto-injector pressed against my sternum, right over the frantic, erratic drumbeat of my heart. All I had to do was push down. The spring-loaded mechanism would fire a cocktail of synthetic epinephrine blockers directly into my bloodstream. It would freeze the heat. It might also freeze my heart. Through the crimson haze of the emergency lights, I watched them, three towering silhouettes detaching themselves from the leather chairs. The heavy, suffocating weight of their pheromones, cedar ozone, and wood smoke began to saturate the dead air, wrapping around my throat like a physical hand. My finger trembled on the trigger. I squeezed my eyes shut, and for a fraction of a second, my mind violently rejected the present reality. It dragged me backward, seeking refuge in a memory where I was the one holding all the power. 3 weeks ago, my Upper East Side clinic was a sanctuary of control. Temperature maintained at exactly 68 degrees. Soundproof walls, the faint sterile scent of medical-grade sanitizers and expensive leather. It was a space designed to strip away the outside world and leave only the raw psychology beneath. They had walked in exactly at 9 in the morning, moving with the synchronized predatory grace unique to Apex Alphas, the Sinclair triplets, Wall Street royalty, men who broke conglomerates before lunch and ruined lives before dinner. I sat behind my mahogany desk, wearing my pristine white coat, my biology perfectly silenced by a fresh dose of experimental suppressants. I was Dr. Julian Hayes, untouchable. Let's establish the parameters. I had said, my voice smooth, clinical, betraying absolutely nothing. In the boardroom, you are gods. In this office, you are patients suffering from early-stage pheromone irritability syndrome. You are here because your aggressive instincts are beginning to bleed into your cognitive function. You will follow my protocols, or you will find another neuropsychiatrist. Declan had taken the center chair. He didn't slouch. He sat like a king, surveying a newly conquered province. His jaw clenched, clearly irritated by the blatant disrespect to his authority, but his dark eyes tracked my every movement with a sharp, dangerous fascination. "We don't take orders well, Doctor." "You will learn," I replied, not breaking eye contact. To Declan's right, Rowan hadn't said a word. He just watched me. While Declan was a blunt instrument of power, Rowan was a scalpel. His gaze felt dissecting, tracking the micro-expressions on my face, the rigid posture of my spine. Even then, behind the chemical wall of my inhibitors, I felt a phantom shiver under his scrutiny. He was looking at me as if trying to solve a puzzle he didn't quite understand yet. And then, there was Holden. He had bypassed the chairs entirely, prowling around the perimeter of my office, trailing a hand over my bookshelves. He deliberately invaded my personal space, stopping just inches behind my chair, close enough that I could feel the ambient heat radiating off his large frame. "You're very tense, Julian." Holden had murmured, his voice a low rumble that resonated in the hollow of my chest. He didn't use my title. It was a calculated test of boundaries. I hadn't flinched. I had simply turned my chair, looking up at him with icy professional detachment. "Sit down, Mr. Sinclair, or the session is over." They hadn't known what I was. My suppressants were flawless. To them, I was a beta, a brilliant, unyielding beta who refused to bow to their pheromones. But their alpha instincts had already bypassed their logic. Without realizing it, they were circling me, testing my defenses, claiming the space around me. In my clinic, I thought I was taming them. I hadn't realized I was just setting the bait. A sudden snap brought me back. The memory shattered. I was slammed back into the suffocating reality of the underground vault. The temperature was easily over 90 degrees now. My vision swam. The scent of jasmine and vanilla was pouring out of me in pathetic heavy waves, thick enough to taste. The heat cycle was tearing through my veins, liquefying my bones, screaming at me to submit, to drop the needle, to let them take over. They were advancing, slow, measured, their eyes reflecting the red emergency lights like wolves in the dark. "Do it," my medical brain screamed. "Inject it now." I braced myself, tightening my grip on the cylinder, preparing to slam it into my chest. A blur of motion, a rush of air smelling violently of crushed winter cedar. Before my brain could even register the movement, Declan was there. He didn't grab me. He didn't touch my skin. His large hand clamped down over the metal cylinder in my fist with bone-crushing force. I gasped a pathetic, broken sound, expecting the strike, expecting the feral alpha instinct to tear me apart. Instead, Declan twisted his wrist. With a sickening crunch, the metal and plastic of the auto-injector shattered in his grip. The synthetic adrenaline leaked down his knuckles, dripping onto the concrete floor. He threw the broken pieces into the darkness. No. I sobbed, my knees finally giving out. I slid down the concrete wall entirely defenseless, my breathing ragged. Please, please. Declan didn't lunge. He dropped to his knees right in front of me, keeping a careful 6 inches of space between our bodies. His chest heaved, his jaw locked so tight the muscles twitched violently. Behind him, Rowan and Holden also dropped to their knees, forming an impenetrable half circle around me. They were shaking. All 3 of them. I could hear the violent, raspy tearing of their breaths as they fought a war against their own DNA. Declan leaned forward, his hands braced flat on the concrete on either side of my head, trapping me but refusing to touch me. His eyes were entirely blown-out pupils dilated to the edges, drowning in instinct. But when he spoke, his voice was a ragged, bleeding command ripped straight from the depths of his soul. "Don't you ever try to kill yourself, Julian." Declan growled, the vibration echoing against the titanium walls. "Breathe, just breathe. We would rather die on this floor than lay a hand on you without your permission. We would rather die on this floor than lay a hand on you without your permission." Declan's words hung in the suffocating heat of the vault, vibrating with a raw, agonizing sincerity that my brain struggled to process. I stared at him, at the sweat tracing the hard lines of his jaw, at the dilated feral darkness of his eyes. He was a predator, starving for a kill, yet he had chained himself to the floor just inches away from me. I looked past him. Rowan's knuckles were white as he gripped his own thighs, his perfectly tailored suit jacket discarded somewhere in the dark. Holden had backed himself into the heavy titanium door, his hands splayed flat against the metal as if trying to push his way through it, his breathing sharp and jagged. My body was screaming for me to submit, to bare my neck and let the biology take over. My blood felt like liquid fire, and the heavy, saturated scent of my own jasmine and vanilla pheromones was making me dizzy. But as I looked at the 3 of them, 3 apex alphas tearing their own minds apart to keep me safe, a fragile, icy sliver of logic pierced through the crimson haze of my panic. I was not prey. I was Dr. Julian Hayes, and I knew how the mind worked. I forced myself to sit up slightly straighter against the concrete wall. My limbs were trembling, soaked in cold sweat, but when I drew a breath, I dug deep into the bedrock of my training. I bypassed the terrified Omega and summoned the neuropsychiatrist. "Declan," I said. My voice was a razor blade cutting through the heavy, pheromone-soaked air. It wasn't loud, but it possessed the absolute unyielding authority of a man used to breaking into the darkest corners of the human psyche. Declan flinched, a full-body shudder, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Step backward." I commanded, my tone smooth, rhythmic, dipping into the cadence of clinical hypnotherapy. 2 paces, do it now." For a terrible second, he didn't move. The alpha instinct in his chest roared against the retreat. I could see the muscles in his neck straining, cords of tension threatening to snap. But then, slowly, agonizingly, he dragged his palms against the concrete, forcing himself backward. 1 pace, 2 paces, he collapsed back onto his heels, chest heaving. "Good," I murmured, maintaining eye contact. I shifted my gaze. "Holden." Holden let out a low, guttural sound from across the room, his eyes burning into me through the emergency lights. He looked the closest to the edge, a caged wolf, desperate to close the distance. "Close your eyes, Holden," I ordered, dropping the pitch of my voice to a soothing, authoritative hum. "Shut off the visual trigger. You cannot see me. You can only hear my voice. Close them." Holden's jaw locked. A violent tremor ran down his massive frame. "Julian." He rasped the word, tearing out of his throat like barbed wire. "Close them," I repeated, infusing every ounce of my fading willpower into the command. He squeezed his eyes shut. His head thumped back against the titanium door, a breathless gasp escaping his lips. "Rowan." I turned to the remaining brother. Rowan was watching me with an intensity that felt like physical contact. He was the analytical one, the one whose mind was a steel trap. Anchor on the numbers. I told him, fighting a sudden violent wave of nausea as my core temperature spiked again. "Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. Count with me, Rowan. 1, 2, 3, 4. Rowan's chest hitched, but he caught the rhythm. I could hear his shaky, controlled breath syncing with my words. For 10 minutes, it worked. It was a terrifying, beautiful stalemate. A sweating, delirious Omega sliding down a concrete wall, holding 3 billionaire alphas hostage with nothing but the cadence of his voice. I kept them anchored. I kept them chained to my words, constantly redirecting their focus away from the overpowering scent that was currently drowning the room. But biology is a cruel, undefeated enemy. The second wave of the heat cycle didn't build. It detonated. It started as an agonizing cramp in my lower abdomen, so sharp and sudden that my breath physically left my lungs. The fragile tether of logic I had woven snapped instantly. My vision went entirely black, then flared into blinding white. The heat wasn't just under my skin anymore. It was melting my bones, liquefying my spine. I cried out. A pathetic, broken, whimpering sound tore its way out of my throat before I could stop it. I curled into a tight ball on the floor, clutching my stomach. The clinical detachment was gone, obliterated in a single heartbeat. I was drowning. My heart was hammering so fast against my ribs it felt like a bird trying to batter its way out of a cage. The ambient heat of the unventilated vault, combined with my soaring internal temperature, was pushing my body toward catastrophic failure. Julian, Declan's voice cracked. His heart rate, Rowan's voice, cut through the dark strip of its usual calm. The analytical mind had diagnosed the terrifying reality. He's going into heat shock. The ambient temperature is too high. He's going to code. No, no, no. Holden chanted the sound of his heavy boots closing the distance in a fraction of a second. I couldn't speak. I couldn't command them. I could only gasp tears of sheer agony and biological terror spilling hot over my cheeks. I was burning alive from the inside out. We have to anchor him. Declan's voice was right above me now. The raw, primal edge of his alpha instinct had returned, but it wasn't driven by lust. It was driven by absolute desperate panic. Scent mark him. Now. Force his biology to recognize a pack. It's the only way to stabilize his vitals. He didn't consent. Holden snarled a vicious protective sound. If we don't do it, he dies on this floor in 2 minutes. Declan roared back. I couldn't open my eyes. I was floating away, the pain so absolute it was beginning to numb my extremities. I felt a rush of displaced air, and suddenly the suffocating heat of the room was pushed back by a heavy, enveloping wall of crushed cedar rain, soaked earth, and sharp wood smoke. 3 large bodies surrounded me, blocking out the world, dropping to their knees on the concrete to pull me back from the edge of the abyss. There is a specific medical term for what was happening to me, pheromonal overload-induced syncope. But clinical terminology is useless when you are actually drowning in it. I didn't feel them touch me at first. I only felt the sudden shocking absence of the agonizing heat. It was replaced by a heavy, invisible blanket that pressed down on my sensory receptors, demanding my nervous system to stand down. Crushed winter cedar, rain-soaked earth, sharp wood smoke. The scents were so thick, so absolute, they tasted like salvation on my tongue. I was vaguely aware of a large calloused hand cupping the back of my neck. Fingers trembling slightly brushed against my scent gland. Then a heavy breath against my skin. It wasn't a bite. It was a firm, deliberate press of a jaw against my pulse point, depositing a concentrated layer of alpha pheromones directly into my bloodstream. I've got him. A deep voice rumbled against my collarbone. Declan! The vibration anchored my frantic heartbeat. Rowan his wrists, Holden the other side of his neck. Saturate him. Don't let the heat spike again. I whimpered, my fingers weakly curling into the fabric of someone's shirt. Holden's. He was holding my upper body against his chest, completely enveloping me in the scent of wood smoke. I could hear his heart hammering, wild and terrified. You're okay, Julian. Holden choked out, pressing his face into my sweat-damp hair. We've got you. Just breathe. You're safe. My body starved for the biological equilibrium that my suppressants had denied it for 6 years, greedily absorbed the scent marking. The violent tremors began to subside. The agonizing cramps melted into a heavy, lethargic warmth. But as the physical pain receded, the neurological toll of the fever took over. My mind, unable to process the profound vulnerability of the moment, fractured. The dark, stifling vault dissolved, and the trauma I had buried beneath layers of medical degrees and pristine white coats clawed its way to the surface. Suddenly, I wasn't in the Sinclair Tower anymore. I was back in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University. The air smelled like sterile alcohol and bitter coffee. Dr. Vance was standing over my desk, his shadow swallowing my research papers. He was an alpha, a highly respected professor, and the man I had foolishly trusted with both my heart and my clinical trials. Did you really think this would be published under your name, Julian? Vance's voice echoed in my delirium, dripping with a condescension that still burned like acid. He tapped a manicured finger on my manuscript. An omega driven by hormones can never be a neuropsychiatrist. You belong on your knees, not in a laboratory. You are a biological liability. You are nothing but a ticking clock of instinct. No, I gasped out loud, tossing my head weakly. No, it's my research. I wrote it. Julian. Rowan's voice broke through the hallucination, sharp with concern. Callous thumbs gently wiped the hot tears streaming down my face. Julian, you're safe. We're here. You think you can suppress what you are. Vance's phantom voice sneered, his face merging with the shadows of the vault. Look at you. The moment things get hot, you fall apart. You'll always be at the mercy of an alpha. Get off me. I sobbed, my arms thrashing blindly. Don't touch me. I'm not a liability. Hey, look at me. Declan commanded softly, catching my flailing wrists and pinning them gently to his chest. He didn't use his alpha tone. He spoke to me the way one speaks to a frightened animal trapped in a snare. Julian, open your eyes. It's Declan. You're not in the past. Whoever hurt you is not in this room. I forced my heavy eyelids open. The emergency crimson light caught the silver in Declan's eyes. He wasn't looking at me like I was prey. He wasn't looking at me the way Vance had, like a useful tool to be exploited and discarded. Declan, Rowan, and Holden were kneeling on the concrete floor, three of the most powerful men in the country, looking at me with a reverence that defied all logic. They had sacrificed their own primal urges, fighting a war against their very DNA just to keep my heart beating. Breathe with me, Julian, Rowan murmured, his hand resting flat and steady over my racing heart. As I stared at them, something inside the deepest, most primal part of my brain clicked. It was an invisible metaphysical tether snapping into place. A pack bond. It formed without my permission, weaving through the scent of cedar rain and smoke, whispering a single undeniable truth to my exhausted soul. Safe. You are finally safe. My eyes fluttered shut. I let out a long, shuddering breath, finally surrendering to the pull of the bond. I let my head rest against Holden's shoulder. And in that exact fraction of a second, the universe decided the joke wasn't over. A deafening clack of the magnetic seals disengaging echoed like a gunshot. A split second later, the backup grid surged to life. The blinding clinical white lights of the vault flickered and then stabilized with agonizing brilliance. The heavy hum of the HVAC system roared back to life, flooding the room with freezing, sterile air. Clear the door, a voice barked from the corridor. The heavy titanium door was wrenched open. 6 armed tactical security guards and 2 paramedics stormed into the room, flashlights sweeping over the scene. Mr. Sinclair, are you all right? The lead guard froze his eyes, taking in the scene. The illusion of the pack bond shattered like thin glass under a hammer. Reality crashed over me like freezing water. The lights were too bright. The air was too cold. I was half naked, curled on the concrete floor, entirely saturated in the scents of 3 billionaire alphas. I wasn't a doctor anymore. I was exactly what Vance had said. I was a vulnerable omega, caught in a compromising, pathetic, biological display in front of half a dozen strangers. No. I scrambled backward, pure, unadulterated panic seizing my throat. Julian, wait. Declan reached for me, his eyes wide. Don't touch me. I screamed, the sound tearing out of my chest, raw and hysterical. I slapped his hand away with a violent strike. The 3 alphas froze, stunned by the sheer terror in my voice. They backed away, their hands raised, their expressions gutted. I didn't look back at them. I grabbed my discarded suit jacket, clutching it desperately over my chest as I scrambled toward the paramedics. The cold detachment, the ice iron walls of Dr. Julian Hayes slammed back into place, locking the terrified Omega away behind a fortress of shame. I drafted my resignation letter on the subway ride to Brooklyn. By the time I unlocked the door to my secluded apartment, my professional ties to the Sinclair Corporation were completely severed. I turned off my phone, disconnected my email, and locked the deadbolt. Then I stepped into the shower and stood under the scalding water until my skin turned raw and red. I scrubbed fiercely, desperately trying to wash away the phantom scents of crushed cedar rain, soaked earth, and sharp wood smoke. It didn't work. The scents weren't just on my skin, they were imprinted on my nervous system. For the first 3 days, I lived in a state of hypervigilant terror. I expected them to kick down my door. I expected the relentless, aggressive pursuit typical of apex alphas who had been denied their claim. I braced myself for the demands, the intimidation, the overwhelming weight of their wealth and influence crashing down on my fragile, newly exposed reality. But the door remained perfectly intact. The silence in my apartment was deafening. They didn't storm my fortress. Instead, they laid a silent, devastatingly gentle siege. It started on the fourth day. A discreet courier left a small, unmarked box outside my door. Inside were precisely formulated, high-grade organic supplements designed to rebuild the stomach lining and replenish the severe caloric deficit caused by a heat crash. There was no note, no demand for a thank you, just the exact optimal medical care I needed, but was too exhausted to procure for myself. Holden. 2 days later, a thick manila envelope arrived. I opened it with trembling hands, expecting legal threats or a non-disclosure agreement. Instead, a stack of peer-reviewed medical journals slid out onto my kitchen island. Every single article was bookmarked. They were exhaustive neurological studies on spontaneous pack bonding under duress. Highlighted sections jumped out at me in neat, precise lines. True metaphysical bonds cannot be forged by temporary biological spikes alone. They require absolute mutual consent at the subconscious level. And beneath that, written in Rowan's elegant, unmistakable handwriting, "You are a man of science, Julian. Look at the data. It wasn't just biology. It was real." I stared at the paper until my vision blurred, my chest aching so profoundly I had to grip the edge of the counter just to remain standing. Then came Declan's maneuver. It was the most subtle yet the most encompassing. I had been terrified of the fallout. Half a dozen security guards and paramedics had seen me in a compromised, undeniable state of omega vulnerability. I waited for the tabloids to leak the scandal. Dr. Julian Hayes, Sinclair therapist, exposed as heat-crazed omega. But the story never broke. In fact, nothing broke. Through a private network, I obsessively tracked the financial news. I noticed a quiet, aggressive shift in the market. Sinclair Media Holdings was systematically buying out 2 of the largest gossip conglomerates in the city and aggressively restructuring a third. Declan wasn't just buying silence, he was rewriting the infrastructure of the press to ensure my name would never be dragged through the mud. They weren't hunting me, they were protecting me. They were giving me the one thing no alpha had ever given me before: space. By the end of the second week, my clinical detachment was crumbling. The logic I used to shield myself felt hollow. I caught myself waking up in the middle of the night, reaching out across the cold, empty mattress, my chest physically burning from the severed distance of the pack bond. My withdrawal syndrome wasn't from the suppressants. It was from them. And then on a Tuesday morning, the world exploded. I was standing in my kitchen, a mug of black coffee growing cold in my hand when the breaking news alert flashed across my television screen. Sinclair Corporation stocks plummet amid shocking allegations. I froze the mug, slipping slightly in my grasp. I turned up the volume. Wall Street is in chaos this morning. The anchor announced, her face grave. Anonymous whistleblowers from within the Sinclair Tower have leaked deeply disturbing allegations regarding the Sinclair triplets. Sources claim that during a security lockdown 2 weeks ago, the brothers engaged in severe predatory alpha misconduct, allegedly assaulting a vulnerable lower-tier employee trapped in the vault with them. The air in my lungs vanished. The board of directors is calling for an emergency meeting, the anchor continued. Furthermore, renowned neuropsychiatrist Dr. Arthur Vance has publicly weighed in, stating, if these allegations are true, it proves that even the most successful alphas are entirely ruled by their base violent instincts. They are unfit to lead a global conglomerate. Vance. The name hit me like a physical blow. The pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. Vance had always backed the Sinclair's primary rivals on Wall Street. He had manipulated the paramedics, twisted the narrative, and weaponized my trauma to orchestrate a corporate assassination. I watched the screen as footage played of Declan, Rowan, and Holden pushing their way through a sea of aggressive paparazzi outside their headquarters. They looked exhausted. Their jaws were tight, their eyes shadowed. A reporter shoved a microphone into Declan's face. "Mr. Sinclair, can you confirm the identity of the Omega in the vault? Are you trying to silence the victim?" Declan stopped. He stared directly into the camera. He could have saved his company in 3 seconds. All he had to do was say my name, produce my medical records, and prove that I was their attending physician who had suffered a biological emergency, not a victim of assault. But Declan Sinclair looked into the lens, his jaw set in iron, and said, "I have absolutely no comment." They were choosing to let their empire burn to the ground rather than expose my secret. The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. I stood there looking at the broken ceramic and then up at the television screen. The fear, the deeply ingrained, paralyzing terror of being an Omega in an Alpha's world suddenly vanished. It evaporated entirely, consumed by a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. Vance thought I was a liability. He thought I would cower in the dark while he destroyed the only 3 men who had ever truly seen me. I stepped over the shattered mug and walked into my bedroom. I opened the closet and reached for the sharpest, most impeccably tailored charcoal suit I owned. I was done running. The Sinclair Tower was a fortress under siege. When my black car pulled up to the loading dock, the front entrance was completely barricaded by news vans and screaming paparazzi. But I knew the building's subterranean routes better than anyone. I bypassed the chaotic lobby and took the private executive elevator straight to the 80th floor. When the steel doors slid open, the tension in the corridor was palpable. A dozen security guards stood outside the main boardroom. They moved to intercept me, but the lead guard, the one who had breached the vault 2 weeks ago, recognized me. He took one look at the cold, unyielding expression on my face and quietly stepped aside, opening the heavy oak double doors. The boardroom was a war zone. At the far end of the massive mahogany table sat the board of directors, their faces flushed with righteous indignation. Standing at the head of the table were Declan, Rowan, and Holden. They were in absolute alpha mode, exuding a suffocating hostile dominance, but underneath it, I could see the profound exhaustion shadowing their features. And sitting to the right of the board, looking remarkably smug in a tailored navy suit, was Dr. Arthur Vance. He had been brought in as an independent medical consultant by the hostile shareholders. The biological reality is undeniable. Vance was saying, his voice smooth and authoritative. Once an alpha is confined with a vulnerable omega, their higher cognitive functions are entirely bypassed by predatory instinct. The Sinclair brothers cannot be trusted to make rational decisions for a global entity if they are slaves to their genetics. That is a fascinating projection, Doctor, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel through skin. Every head snapped toward the entrance. Declan's head jerked up, his silver eyes widening in sheer disbelief. Rowan's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, while Holden let out a low, involuntary sound that vibrated deep in his chest. Declan breathed, taking a half step forward before forcing himself to stop. I ignored the board. I ignored the brothers for a fraction of a second, keeping my eyes entirely locked on Arthur Vance. I walked slowly into the room, the click of my shoes on the hardwood floor, the only sound in the dead silence. Dr. Julian Hayes, Vance sneered, recovering quickly, though a flash of unease crossed his eyes. This is a closed board meeting, and as the victim of this unfortunate biological event, you shouldn't be here. I am the chief consulting neuropsychiatrist for the Sinclair Corporation. I interrupted, my tone laced with glacial authority. I stopped at the head of the table, standing directly beside Declan, and the only biological event that occurred in that vault was my own. The board members began to murmur. One of the senior shareholders leaned forward. Dr. Hayes, you don't have to cover for them. We have anonymous reports of severe assault. You have a fabricated narrative orchestrated by a man who has spent his entire career threatened by omegas. I countered, gesturing to Vance. I placed a thick file on the table. These are my certified medical records. 2 weeks ago, due to a severe HVAC failure, I suffered a catastrophic failure of my hormone suppressants. The resulting condition was pheromonal overload-induced syncope. I turned to look directly at the cameras broadcasting the meeting to the shareholders. I was not attacked. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. I was trapped in a heat-induced medical emergency, and the 3 men standing behind me did not assault me. They chained themselves to the concrete floor and nearly destroyed their own nervous systems, fighting their alpha instincts just to keep me safe. He's brainwashed. Vance stood up, his face twisting into something ugly. Look at him. He's an omega completely saturated by their pheromones. He's speaking out of biological submission, not logic. He's been bitten. You're right about one thing, Vance, I said softly. I reached up to the pristine knot of my silk tie. I loosened it with deliberate, unhurried movements. Then I unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of my dress shirt. I reached beneath the collar and peeled away the medical bandage I had meticulously applied every day for the past 2 weeks. There were no bite marks, no blood. Instead, blooming across the delicate skin over my pulse point were 3 distinct deep purple bruises, the undeniable visual proof of a metaphysical pact bond. It wasn't a claim of ownership, it was a mark of mutual survival. The room erupted into gasps. Even the board members fell silent, staring at the physical manifestation of an alpha's absolute restraint. They hadn't claimed me. They had anchored me. They are the most disciplined, iron-willed alphas on this continent. I said, my voice unwavering, staring Vance down until he slowly sank back into his chair, utterly defeated. And I am a neuropsychiatrist who knows exactly what he is doing. I chose them. I didn't wait for the board to adjourn. I didn't care about the cameras anymore. I turned and walked toward the private executive suite attached to the boardroom. The door hadn't even fully clicked shut behind me when I felt the rush of air. Suddenly I was surrounded. The heavy, intoxicating scents of crushed cedar rain, soaked earth, and sharp wood smoke enveloped me entirely. Julian, Rowan choked out. He reached me first, his hands trembling as they hovered over my shoulders as if afraid I was a mirage. You shouldn't have done that, Declan said, his voice raw, his chest heaving as he stared down at me. You just outed yourself to the world. You sacrificed your privacy, your fortress for us. You were willing to lose your empire for me, I replied, my voice shaking for the first time since I entered the building. I looked up into Declan's silver eyes. I wasn't going to let him destroy you. Holden stepped closer, crowding into my space. He reached out his large, calloused fingers, gently, reverently tracing the edge of the dark bruises on my neck. A shudder ran through my entire body at the contact of the pack bond singing in my blood. Declan stepped into my space, his hands gently framing my face, his thumbs brushed over my cheekbones. We didn't save you in that room, Julian. He whispered, his forehead coming to rest against mine. Your resilience, your beautiful, terrifying mind, you saved our madness. I didn't have any more words. The fortress of Dr. Julian Hayes, the ice iron walls I had built to keep the world out, finally and completely shattered. But I wasn't falling. I reached out my hands, grabbing the lapels of Declan's suit, and pulled him down. At the same time, Rowan wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, pulling me flush against his chest, while Holden buried his face in the crook of my neck. It was a chaotic, desperate embrace, a collision of four people who had finally stopped running. I closed my eyes, breathing in the cedar, the rain, and the smoke, entirely surrendered, entirely safe, and entirely theirs. There is a profound clinical difference between surviving and living. For the first 30 years of my life, I was a master of survival. I built fortresses out of medical degrees, chemical suppressants, and ironclad emotional detachment. I thought that if I could just control every variable, I would never have to be vulnerable. It took being locked in a lightless, suffocating vault to teach me that true control isn't about building walls. It's about knowing who you can trust when the walls inevitably collapse. Exactly 1 year later, the memory of that crimson-lit bunker felt like it belonged to another lifetime. I sat at the massive oak desk in my private office, the floor-to-ceiling windows thrown wide open to let in the Atlantic breeze. The Sinclair family's coastal estate in the Hamptons was a masterpiece of glass light and open space, the exact physical antithesis of the underground room where everything had begun. I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight warming my face, and signed the final line of my latest research manuscript. The title read, "The Efficacy of Metaphysical Pack Bonding in Reversing Advanced Pheromone Irritability Syndrome." The medical community was already calling it the most groundbreaking psychiatric study of the decade. Following the very public, very explosive boardroom incident last year, my private practice hadn't collapsed as Dr. Vance had once predicted. Instead, it had skyrocketed. I was no longer just Dr. Julian Hayes, the untouchable beta. I was the world's preeminent omega neuropsychiatrist. I hadn't lost my clinical authority. I had redefined it. And Arthur Vance, after my public dismantling of his orchestrated coup, his credibility had shattered. The Wall Street elite dropped him overnight. His clinic closed within the month. It was a surgical, bloodless consequence that the Sinclair brothers had overseen with terrifying efficiency. I closed the leather-bound folder on my desk, my fingers lightly brushing the edge of the collar of my shirt. I didn't wear medical bandages anymore. I didn't wear suppressants. The deep purple bruising over my scent gland had long since faded into a permanent silver-white crescent, the physical scar of a biological miracle. It was the tether that kept four separate universes perfectly aligned. The Sinclair triplets still ruled Wall Street. They were still apex predators in the boardroom, ruthless and uncompromising. But the volatility, the dangerous edge of pheromone irritability that had originally brought them to my clinic was completely eradicated. They didn't need therapy anymore. They just needed an anchor. My biological reality didn't make me weak. It made me the grounding force for the 3 most powerful men on the continent. Whenever the pressure of their empire threatened to push them into feral alpha mode, they didn't need medication. They just came home to me. I finally understood that love isn't about surrendering your independence to a biological imperative. It isn't about letting instinct overwrite logic. Love is finding the exact people who are willing to chain themselves to the floor and sit in the absolute dark with you fighting their own demons just to keep you safe until the doors finally open. A sharp rhythmic knocking sound on the glass door pulled me from my thoughts. I didn't even need to look up to know who it was. The heavy, comforting scents of crushed cedar rain, soaked earth, and sharp wood smoke had already drifted into the room, instantly unraveling the residual tension in my shoulders. The door swung open. Holden stepped in first, his massive frame clad in a soft, oversized sweater that looked absurdly domestic on him. He walked straight to my desk and set down a steaming mug of decaffeinated coffee. He pressed a warm, calloused hand to the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the silver scar over my pulse point. "You promised you'd take a break at 3, Doc," Holden murmured, leaning down to press a kiss to my temple. "It's 3:15. You're violating the terms of your own prescription." Rowan drifted into the room right behind him, barefoot, holding a half-read paperback novel with his finger marking the page. He didn't say a word, simply moving to the leather sofa against the far wall and stretching out like a contented cat. He caught my eye over the top of his book, a quiet, knowing smile lifting the corner of his mouth. Just his presence, steady, analytical, and utterly relaxed, slowed my heart rate to a perfect resting rhythm. Finally, Declan appeared in the doorway. He was still wearing the dark trousers of a suit, though his tie was gone and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He leaned his shoulder against the door frame, his arms crossed over his chest, fixing me with that piercing silver gaze. 4 hours, Julian. Declan scolded, though his alpha tone lacked any real bite. It was laced with pure, unadulterated adoration. "You've been staring at those patient files for 4 hours. The global medical community can survive without your genius for 1 afternoon. The pack, however, is currently suffering from severe omega deprivation." I looked at the 3 of them. 3 billionaires. 3 apex predators. 3 men who looked at me like I was the center of gravity itself. I didn't reach for my pen. I didn't try to formulate a logical clinical excuse to keep working. The ice-iron walls of my past were gone, replaced by something infinitely stronger. "Diagnosis accepted, Mr. Sinclair," I said softly, a genuine smile breaking across my face. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and left the medical files on the desk. As I walked out from behind the heavy mahogany, Declan's eyes darkened with instant heat. Holden's hand reached out to catch my waist, and Rowan closed his book entirely. I stepped into the intersection of cedar rain and smoke. The door to the home office clicked shut behind us, leaving the world outside exactly where it belonged, while I finally completely surrendered to the beautiful madness of being exactly where I was meant to be.